This week I was inspired by our Christian education series on learning to study the Bible like a preacher, so I might have nerded out a little more than I normally do going deep into the history here. I'm going to ask you to stay with me because we're going somewhere. Come along for the ride. In the second half of the 8th century BCE, there lived a man named Micah. What does a prophet who served 2,800 years ago have to speak into our present day? Turns out quite a lot. It's been said that the primary concern of Israel's prophets was with foreign politics. If that's true, then Micah had a lot to be concerned about. The end of national independence, though it was still 200 years away, was already looming. Israel's neighbor, Assyria, had embarked on a not at all subtle imperial expansion. Their empire building marked the beginning of a series of world empires on whose policies the fate of the Jewish people would depend. Assyria's success was built on a well-trained and organized standing army, which, unlike the people they fought against, the warriors did not have to go home at harvest time to harvest crops. That is, they were not amateur farmer soldiers. They were paid professional soldiers who did it 12 months of the year. Technologically, their military was far in advance of their competitors, especially when it came to siege warfare, which they used against city after city that they wanted to overcome. According to the premier historian of this period of biblical history, and I quote, "The Assyrians also appear to have used atrocities against civilian populations and mass deportations as deliberate instruments of policy." Sound familiar? Their ruler, Tiglath-Pileser III, called himself the king of the world. Under his rule, Israel became a vassal state to the Assyrian Empire. Let's call them the 51st state. During the king's rule, power was redistributed to benefit the wealthy. And so this furthered the divide between rich and poor and between urban and rural. The ruling classes in the capital were driving independent farmers off the land, and they were finding arcane loopholes in the laws to take away people's homeland that their family had farmed for centuries. The imperialism bled into the theology of the temple in Jerusalem. That is, what they were like in the world and politics bled into what their religion looked like and their worship. And so the wealthy could afford these showy displays of temple offerings, large animals, vats of olive oil. And the larger and the more public and impressive the offering, the greater the whispers in the crowd. Look at how religious he must be. Look at how sacrificial she's being. In this, a class of professional prophets emerged who were employed by the temple, and these so-called prophets were paid sycophants to tell the king that everything he was doing was okay. "Don't worry," they whispered in his ear, "God is on your side." Meanwhile, they led the ordinary people astray because the true goal of their prophesying was profit with a capital F. Into this political and religious dumpster fire, the prophet Micah steps. The first thing to know about him is that he hates the title prophet. He doesn't use it because he doesn't want to be associated with the well-paid soothsayers that the king pays. He is not a professional. He's an amateur. We might call him a farmer prophet because, as far as we can tell from the text, he himself may have belonged to a class known as the people of the land. These were independent landowners. We might call them small-scale growers. And they were likely socially and politically conservative and very suspicious of this huge apparatus of civil and religious machinery. During his ministry, Micah called it that Jerusalem and the temple were going to fall. And this did not endear him to the powers that be, but he was correct. It did. And so, with an eye to all these factors, this is how we're to enter into chapter 6 of Micah's prophetic words to the people of God. In our sermon series, What Are You Looking For? Today we pause to reflect on the word humility. Let's see what Micah has to teach us. Micah formulates a, if not the, religious question. What must I do to approach God? Quoting the same biblical historian as before, for the normative state religion of Israel, the answer is clear. God can only be approached, meaning in effect, sin can only be removed through the sacrificial system. Guess who controlled the sacrificial system? The temple. But the imaginations of the professional prophets that the king paid to work there had been absolutely co-opted by the king's ambitions. And so long before the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, the inner cathedral, that inner place of spiritual integrity, had already been overthrown. According to the quid pro quo, that is, I give you something, you give me something, that had become the religion, you came before God with a sacrificial offering, the bigger the better. Hence Micah's rhetorical questions in increasing exaggeration. What shall I come before the Lord? Burnt offerings? Fatted calves? Thousands of sheep? 10,000s of rivers of oil? What about my firstborn kid? It's an inclined treadmill set in an impossible angle that no one can walk. Micah saw with brutal clarity what was actually going on. These offerings were gestures done not to draw closer to God, but to be done with God. To buy God off so you never have to deal with him again. You paid your tax exactly like you did to the king, enough to shut him up until he came around asking a year later. And so Micah's critique is levied, at least in part, against the huge economic burden that this sacrificial system represented for regular, ordinary farming folk. Those who could not afford the fattened calf or the vats of oil. And so, how could the poor hope to approach God to have their sins forgiven? In a system that was designed to be stacked against them, how could ordinary folks hope to approach God who seemed far off? Or to extend the question further, in an age of violence and empire building and land foreclosure and civilian killings and mass deportations and the loss of national independence, where do you find God? This was Micah's world. This is our world. It's here where the farmer prophet Micah deploys the genius of his spiritual imagination that has not been bought off. After making fun of the egregiousness of the professional gifts, he says, God has already told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? The Assyrian leader referred to himself as the king of the world. Micah's words are not addressed to him, for the word of the Lord is wasted on self-proclaimed kings. The words of the farmer prophet are addressed to those who know themselves to be mortal. Justice, kindness, humility. It's with these qualities that we are to approach God and our neighbor, and if we believe Jesus, even our enemy. Of those three qualities, I'd like to close with just a few words about humility. Spiritual writer Richard Foster, in his book entitled Prayer, writes this: humility means to live as close to the truth as possible. The truth about ourselves, the truth about others, the truth about the world in which we live. It does not mean groveling or finding the worst possible things to say about ourselves. Humility is in fact filled with power to bring forth life. He finishes by saying the word itself comes from the Latin humus, which means fertile ground. In one sense, humility is nothing more than staying close to the earth. How do we do that then? In an age of so many distractions and so much self-promotion, how do we actually practice humility? I'd like to share three pieces. First, there are proposed changes right now to federal legislation in Canada that it would make it illegal for farmers to save their own seeds. The National Farmers Union of Canada has come out to say that these changes will give multinational seed companies control over Canada's seed supply. I went to go sign the petition this week, but it's already closed. But if you go to the National Farmers Union website, you can find out how to learn more about this issue and to protest it. Number two, and this comes from a question posed to our small groups this week. Think of a moment this week where you had a choice: be right or be kind. What did you choose? What would you want to do next time? Finally, the word humility has the same root as the word humiliation, which is uncomfortable. And yet Jesus finishes those Beatitudes with, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." You and I live in an age of studied outrage where there is nothing more popular and common than ranting about all the things we're angry about. There's a lot of things to be angry about. There's a lot of injustices being done. Sometimes it can be a practice of humility to not have the last word, to not send the angry email, to not respond to the conversation by you having to close it off. And in that, we leave space for God to work and perhaps for humility to grow in us. Amen.